How are these boots $765, and why would anybody spend that kind of money on a pair of boots? Well, we're gonna try to answer those questions by not just cutting them in half and running through our test, but also explaining each and every step in the process to show you why this boot is probably the most labor-intensive boot made in the US, why it takes 6 times longer to make than most boots, why it feels so unique and unlike any other boot on the market to a point where people have been wearing these for generations, and how Russell has stayed alive even though the majority of moccasin makers in the United States have gone extinct. Russell has a really unique and long and cool history, and we covered it pretty extensively in the vintage Russell moccasin video, so go watch that for the full story. But your Cliff Note version is the unique thing about this boot is how it combines the traditional Native American moccasin dating back hundreds and hundreds of years with the classic European style of boot making. So the story really starts hundreds of years ago, but Russell Moccasins was officially started in 1898 after William C. Russell acquired the Wright Shoe Company and started making moccasins along with stitched down construction boots. Then in 1910, what really put Russell on the map was their patented overlap seam that made these boots more durable and more water resistant that I'll show you later in the video. And they continue to grow in popularity decade after decade with a lot of notable people owning and wearing a pair of Russells like President Coolidge, President Eisenhower, President Bush, General Jimmy Doolittle, General Norman Schwarzkopf, General Norman Schwarzkopf, Prince of Wales, Harrison Ford, Robert Redford, Matt Damon, Tom Selleck, Larry Hagman, John Wayne, Charles Lindbergh, Wiley Post, and Earl Schaefer. But unfortunately, after COVID, Russell Moccasins was really struggling, and in 2022, with the full blessing of the Russell family, they sold the company not to some giant corporate conglomerate, but to a group of younger dudes that have slowly been rebuilding the procedures and processes, updating the company, getting it more digital with social media, the website, and even an online sizing process where you take a photo, have a little credit card next to it, and it tells you your exact size. So Russell has this really cool long history. So what was it about this brand and what they make that makes it so special and unlike any other boot on the market and kept it alive for all these years? Well, the boot that we have is obviously the brand is Russell Moccasin. The style is the backcountry. They weigh 1 pound, 14 ounces. They retail for $765. They're made in the United States. And the way they position this boot is made from the original Russell bird shooter pattern. The backcountry's lineage is that of a most accomplished boot in American history. Wiley Post became the first person to fly to the stratosphere in a pair. Earl Schaefer wore his pair over 2,000 miles, becoming the first man to complete the Appalachian Trail. Both of these pairs are now housed in the Smithsonian Museum, just so you know, pretty wild. But this boot is made to be lightweight, highly water resistant, and extremely durable. The backcountry is a boot we recommend as customers' first pair. If you want a pair of Russells that can be worn from sea to summit in incredible comfort, the backcountry is your boot. And if you want a pair of these, consider using the links in the description because occasionally that helps us out. And I'll also put all the other Russell Moccasin content we've made with the vintage pair, with the unboxings, and I'll put all that in the links in the description. We're running our Independence Day or 4th of July sale from July 4th to July 7th. It's 25% off the entire site. And why not celebrate the birth of this great country, Independence Day, by supporting one of your favorite US-based companies here at Rose Anvil. We make all of our stuff here in the US out of US tanned leather, hand make everything by hand here in the shop. Get yourself a new belt. We've got our whole range of wallets are hand stitched by us, not with a sewing machine, a single thread and 2 needles with a saddle stitching technique. Check out our camera gear. We got our lasso link that has articulating little links of leather so it can bend and fold around your neck. It's adjustable. And our boot products with the kill tees, the boot pocket kit, the new boot breakers. All of it's on sale, 25% off, 4th of July to July 7th. Check it out below. So now, rather than going through all the material details in this video, I wanted to spend the time explaining where the biggest expense of this product comes from and how it's made, because if you thought Pacific Northwest boots are handmade and labor intensive, this boot is in a league of its own. I've never seen a boot come even close to the amount of handmade techniques in a single boot. And it all starts by grabbing a Munson last and attaching a heel rand. And if you don't know what a Munson last is, it was developed for World War II. It's one of the most successful lasts of all time and one of the very first anatomical last, and there's even a book written about it. And once that rand's attached, next you go to the wet forming of the heel counter. The heel counter is what supports your heel when the full boot is made, and unlike most counters in other boots, this counter wraps all the way under the heel. And as it's being wet formed, they have to slowly tack it in and roll the leather. If it goes too much one way, you're gonna get a lump. If it's too tight, you're not gonna have enough material. Then while that's drying, they start working on hand cutting out the upper of the boot. And the reason they do this is moccasin constructions have to have very tight tolerances because the seams and the last lastings are on top of the boot rather than being wrapped underneath. So Russell cuts all their patterns by hand the traditional way, which is absolutely insane to me because even in our small leather goods production, we still use clickers and clicker dies, which is how the vast majority of stitched down and welted boots are, because they can use those clicker dies to fit a wide range of different sizes, because those types of boots have a lot larger lasting allowances than all those hand cut pieces from the vamp, quarter, and backstay are assembled on a wax thread chain stitch Puritan machine. And this machine is so cool. It sews 2 stitches at the same time and it waxes as it's being sewn, and it creates these big loop stitches rather than your typical lock stitch. This is supposed to be more durable and stronger for high wear spots. That's why you see it in like Red Wings where the vamp meets the quarter. And the coolest thing about this whole thing is these machines are super old and super hard to find because they don't really make them anymore. So they're just really rare machine and they're very prized possessions by these brands. They also use a zigzag stitch machine up the heel stay, but the vast majority of other boots just use regular sewing machines across the entire boot. And even more so, the really cheap ones, they have a lot of automated sewing machines. Next, with the last and the rand and dry counter attached, is put into the upper of the boot, partially sewn together, and are glued together and tacked into place. And now the easy part is over, and the fun begins with the most skill intensive and labor intensive part of this boot, which is the lasting of it. And the guys that do this have trained for years and years. They have their own slightly varied techniques of how to do it. It really is a true art in boot making, and you just can't take someone off the street and teach them in a few weeks. It takes a long time to hone these skills, and I'll show you why. Because the first and easiest lasting step is they last the heel by taking the pliers, gripping it, and pulling it around the same way they did the counter, and tack it into place. And once again, if you pull too hard in one direction, it's going to be crooked. If you pull not enough, it's going to be big lumps and too baggy. And this heel lasting for most companies is done by a heel lasting machine that grips the leather and pulls it over in a few seconds. And really there's only a few last bastions of handmade United States boots that still last the counter by hand, like the Pacific Northwest brands. Basically everyone else uses machines. Next, they last the toe, a similar process but completely reversed, because basically every other boot that is made is lasted from the top down to the bottom, rather than like a moccasin construction that starts at the bottom and is lasted up. But this is just the first time that they're lasting the toe, and it's just to get that leather to take that shape and get it to have a little bit of memory of the last. And now that all that is lasted and glued together, they glue on an oak leather midsole, which is the top tier choice for midsoles. This layer adds rigidity, it adds a little bit support, and it gives you that material that can be compressed to give you that custom footprint inside of your boot, making it more comfortable. Now they remove all those nails and undo the lasting so that they can Blake stitch on that midsole with another super cool old school machine, the Model D sewing machine. And what the stitch does is it sews together the counter down to the vamp and midsole, locking all that in place. And so that's why they wrap that counter so deep and far underneath of the insole so that it can all be Blake stitched and sewn together. And keep in mind, most boots, even a lot of the handmade boots, have a single lasting phase. This boot has 5 individual lasting phases. And I think we're only on phase 3 of the lasting, because next what they do is to help the water resistance and give you a little bit more support, they essentially make a leather sock out of hydrophobic silicone infused leather, which is sewn together on another really cool machine, an overstitch machine. And now that leather sock is lasted on that same last and allowed to dry, because next they're going to join the inner vamp of that leather sock to the upper. So after it's fully dried with the last in it, they insert it back into the upper of the boot, and it's glued into place, sealing all those needle holes and all the piercings in the vamp and the quarter. Next, they remove that last, and that leather sock lining, that inner vamp, is sewn into the boot at the juncture of the vamp and quarter. Which what all this does is it essentially makes the boot waterproof below that seam. And most other boots are either not waterproofed, or they use a synthetic waterproof lining that's prone to failure, especially after some serious use. And I didn't think there was a more heritage version or alternative to waterproofing a boot with a lining, but that's what this is. And I honestly had no idea that this is even possible before this video. Now that all that is done, it's finally time to put in that toe piece and the tongue and create that mock toe stitch. So they take that U-shaped piece that's sewn to the tongue and they sew it into the quarters. They attach all the eyelets and speed hooks, which is done with another really cool old machine. And these old machines are cool, but you have to keep in mind, and they're a completely different ball game than modern machines. There's so much work, they're really hard to find, they're hard to maintain. So they're essentially making the same boots in the same way with the same machines from 100 years ago. And one of the last steps, and easily one of the hardest steps, is sewing on this mock toe stitch. And if something goes wrong in this step, all the work that was put in up to this point could easily go to waste. And the way they do this is they take a piece of thread and 2 needles attached to either end of that thread, and they saddle stitch this mock toe stitch on. And a saddle stitch is completely different than a machine lock stitch where they're dependent on each other for tension and strength. That if you like pop a stitch on any sewing machine, that's why it all comes unraveled. Whereas saddle stitching is more you're weaving the thread together and they're not linking on each other. The benefit of that is you can use a lot thicker thread. If you pop a stitch, it doesn't completely come unraveled, and it's just significantly more durable. And almost no other boot companies do this because it's such a pain. Trust me, we hand sew all of our wallets here in the shop, and it takes several times longer to saddle stitch a wallet compared to a sewing machine, like probably like 10 times longer, if not more. And that's just a wallet already lined up, already has the holes punched in it. There's no adjusting, there's no fitting the panels, there's no tensioning that needs to take place. And this is also that patent pending part that helped really put Russell on the map and I think kept them alive for so long, where instead of it just joining together like this, that top U-shaped piece is wrapped around that vamp piece and then sewn together. So you're sewing through 3 layers of leather. And so you have a lot more leather, it's more durable, it's not gonna wear out as fast, it's easier to repair, it's more watertight because you don't have that joint at the very top where water could get into. But that mostly completes the upper. So the next step is probably the most confusing stitch on this entire boot, which is right here on the outside. When people see this, they think it's a Goodyear welted boot because it looks just like one, but it's not Goodyear welted, even though that stitch does a similar thing, because what they do is they take that rubber slip sole, glue it on, and then that's sewn to that leather midsole. And the reason they do that is that rubber slip sole bonds better to that rubber outsole, and it's also a replaceable layer just in case the cobbler sands through too much or it gets damaged. It's a lot easier to replace that than that leather midsole. And then finally, the last part is gluing on that rubber outsole. So you can understand why these boots aren't always identical. Even down to the 2 pairs that I have, you can see they're pretty different. And I understand why people would want their boots to be completely flawless, but to me it's the difference between buying something that's truly handmade versus buying something cheap off Amazon. They have 2 different looks. So now let's cut them in half so I can show you how all these layers connect internally, and I can show you how all those super handmade details actually affect the way this boot performs and feels, and why you can only get this specific feel from a boot made this way. All right, we got them cut in half, and if you're not subscribed, consider doing it. It's just one free little click that supports us and allows us to cut apart brand new products every single week. And this boot felt especially criminal to cut in half after understanding almost how intimate the making of each boot is compared to any other boot making technique. But that's what we do to be able to show you all this. So let's see what's inside. Now that we have it cut, you can really see how all these layers interact and connect in certain ways. And look at how different it is compared to even just a regular Goodyear welted boot. You can see there is a little bit of cork filling in there, a nice thick veg tan counter, a half sock liner with a little bit of foam underneath, how the leather sock attaches and is sewn here and how seamless that is. And you can see that leatherboard rand that was the first step in this entire process. And I didn't expect to see leatherboard inside this boot, and so I wanted to ask Russell their opinion and why they use that specific material. And they said if we were to keep a heavy leather rand in addition to the inner vamp and sock liner, your heel would sit too high, making the counter sit too low on the heel, which would cause a bite at the heel. If we went with a thinner all leather rand, it wouldn't be hard enough to fill all the layers underneath, including the nails and everything that's lasted underneath. You need a hard but thin material that can still be sewn through, and leatherboard fits that perfectly. So pretty good information on the never-ending debate about leatherboard. But what about the lack of shank? Well, Moccasin Constructions is the least inhibitive of natural balance, gait, and movement of the foot. The shank doesn't match the heel to ball measurement perfectly. It can inhibit flexing of the foot and cause terrible comfort issues. Our solution is much like Pacific Northwest makers. The combination of leather midsole and the rubber midsole stiffen that area just enough to provide support and a gentle bend towards the ball. And something I didn't notice till we cut it in half was this outsole is specifically designed to support that arch area where you might not need a shank, because look how much more thick that is compared to its even luggier and more rugged counterpart that's really thin. It's built up so you don't have to have a shank. So those 2 layers plus the outsole act as the shank for this boot. And all those little intricacies and details and differences are what make this boot feel complete completely different and unique, especially that seamless transition from the insole up to the sidewall, compared to a Goodyear welted boot where you've got that thick leather insole and a hard edge and a hard lip that you can feel underneath your foot. And that lack of transition is what makes this boot shaped to your foot like a leather sock, completely molding to your foot uniquely, bulging out the sides, compressing over here, flattening here, and even that flat construction is really unique. And these are water resistant in a way that we've really never seen in any other boot that doesn't have the flaws inherent to a synthetic waterproof lining. So that's why they're so comfortable and feel so unique underfoot, and why people have been wearing these for generations. But why are they so expensive? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the most labor-intensive process we've ever covered. It's super handmade. The time to make these is off the charts. Most cheap boots take under an hour to make. Even the Pacific Northwest boots take 2 hours or under to make. This takes 6 hours to make a pair of these boots. And the crazy thing is you can't really streamline a lot of these processes, unlike these other styles of boots. And it's a small team making small quantities. The reason I wanted to do this video this way is just looking at the inside, it's really easy to say it's not worth the money. But in order to make this boot, you have to charge that amount of money. So in order to get some of the attributes and features and benefits you can only get from a moccasin style construction, that as far as I know has to be done by hand. So for some people, it might not be even close to being worth the price, while other people, it's well worth the price because they want exactly this. But the fact that Russell has survived for so long is a testament not to just the quality of the boot, but to the value that this very unique style of construction brings to people. Because this really is this cool relic of a former era in footwear when things were made for quality above all else. Not chasing margins and turnaround times, BS marketing, corporate overlords, shareholders, just a product that speaks for itself, that can trace its lineage back hundreds and hundreds of years. There are some other moccasin makers, but this style specifically is really the last of its kind. So now you understand why these boots are so expensive, why they're the most labor-intensive boots that we've ever seen, and how this boot company has somehow survived through all the chaos over the last 100+ years. And as a boot nerd, and as a leather nerd, and a handmade goods nerd, this is a really cool testament to show that sometimes handmade stuff is just unbeatable. Regardless of the money that people throw at things, on occasion you get something that is undeniably better handmade than any other technique. And I just love that. I just geek out over it so hard. And next on the docket for Russell is looking deeper into the actual materials of this boot that we weren't able to cover and compare it to the nearly 100-year-old pair we cut apart last time. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out and all the other stuff that we've talked about below. And if you want a pair of Russells, check them out via the link in my description. And thank you guys for watching this and supporting this, because it took a long time to put all this together, and the only way we can do it is with your guys' support. So thank you guys. See ya.